We'd like to welcome you all so much for joining us for our first Awaken online series on storytelling, stories, crisis, and community. For those of you who don't know Envy, we are a civil society organization. We work with strengthening the civil society, building community, bringing together change makers and people from cross sectors to collaborate on working on issues that face all of us in Kuwait. Throughout our work, we have found that storytelling is a powerful tool for bringing communities together. And because of this, we have a series called Awaken. We've had two big festivals built around multi arts platforms and storytelling to engage diverse voices from across our communities. Tonight, we are going to be looking at how stories define us, our identity, our community, and shape how we deal with communal issues and challenges on both the personal and the communal level. What do stories mean to us, and what is the power of stories, and how do they build our social fabric? We will be joined by two of our collaborators for the Awaken Festival in 2018 and 2019. Fatmah Al-Qadfan, a registered drama therapist. Hello, Fatmah. She will be sharing with us her experiences related to stories and meaning tonight, and has been an active collaborator throughout our Awaken Festival. And Ghzayil and Harbi, who is a political communications consultant and storyteller, who was also very integral to our residency program for the 2019 Awaken Storytellers. So we're really thrilled that they're joining us. And before we start our conversation, my colleague Leon will be giving you a little orientation on how to use the Q&A, because we will be trying to listen to your questions and answer them, address them either throughout the conversation or at the end of our webinar. Leon?
Hi guys, thank you so much for your time. We are so excited to have you here with us today. So just right before we get started, I just want to quickly go over the different features that you can use as the attendees of this webinar. So if you can see, you'll find a Q&A section on the bottom of your panel. And if you click over there, you will find a series or a chat feature where you can put in your questions. So we're actually going to be taking in questions throughout the webinar, which Eleanor and I will be reading out to both Fatmah and Ghzayil. So if you have any questions to share, feel free to do that then. We're also going to be having a more intensive Q&A section at the end of the webinar, and hopefully we'll get a chance to answer some or most of your questions. Another thing that you guys can do, which is quite cool, is if you're looking at the questions that other people are sharing, you have the choice to click the thumbs up button and upvote the questions that other people are sharing if you're particularly interested in them or really want to hear the answers to them. Otherwise, you have a chat option, and if there are any issues and you need to communicate with either myself or Eleanor, then you can send a personal message to us. And that's about it.
One reminder before we start, in all of our Awaken spaces, we try to keep it very real. We do embrace discomfort. We do embrace differences of opinion. But what is very critical to us is that we hold space for one another's stories and insights with compassion and open minds and open hearts. So I just want to say that before we start. And then I just want to start out with a question for Zel and Fatima. So we know that the two of you care about stories and feel that they're very important and work with stories. And we also have felt that they're very powerful in our community building work. I'd be interested to know how you define stories and what you feel their role plays in the collective and personal experiences of people and community?
That is a big question, isn't it?
It's loaded.
Yeah. Uh, uh, Fatma, I'll just start because I feel like mine is a broader look at how stories shape society. So because I studied political communication and media in general. So much of what we do, what we look at mostly, is narratives and myths, and not in the sense that we ask who actually has the influence to affect how we speak about others and speak about ourselves. And for example, in political communication, it's much more institutional. It's not very much about individualistic stories of people saying their individual stories. It's about how do the institutions that we know today, as they are today, how do they affect the way we look at the world and our reality? And usually, the gatekeepers to reality today is the media, whether it's social media or traditional media. And so much of my work was in the aspect of, is media mediating or is it creating reality for us? And so the bigger question about who we are and our identity, for example, specifically in Kuwait, it's very much set in nostalgia and the race to find who is original, who is worthy, who is uh, who is enough. And then it goes down to how it affects us personally, which Fatma then takes on.
Thank you, Ghzayil. You're right. For me, the story starts with the individual. I see it as an organizational tool, a way that someone organizes information in their head about themselves, about their experience in life, about their identity. I think we're storytellers at such a young age. It's how we learn. And so, for example, if you're about to tell a child that today we're going to wake up, brush our teeth, and get dressed and go to school, and when we're back, we can play a game together and have ice cream. You just told a story with a very clear beginning, middle, and end to the child, and that's how children remember information. That's how they relay information later. And I think we absorb stories from all around us. Some of them are verbally communicated to us, whereas other stories are nonverbal. Either there are visual cues in our surroundings that become part of our personal narrative, and some of them are geographical stories. And so often you hear people define themselves by their geography. So they tell stories about, we are people of the sea, we are people of the desert, we grew up in mountains, and what that means. So stories become markers of identity, a way of figuring out who we are. And then when we take ownership of these stories, that's when we are empowered and able to, I think, shape the present moment, as opposed to if somebody else holds our narrative for us, that's when we feel disempowered, or we feel violated, or we don't feel like we're in control.
I think for me as well, looking at how it is now, Fatma, like I'm sure you're dealing with a lot of people's anxieties with Corona and what's happening. And I wonder, it feels like, I think the biggest issue, because before we talk about how stories heal, how they actually can help if we use them correctly, I think it's very important to see how they shaped our problems today.
Yes. How they wound, maybe.
Oh, that's a good word. Wound, isn't it? So today, for example, when we're looking at Corona and what's happening with the narratives of the issue, who is responsible, who do we look to, and what does it mean about ourselves and our identity? So usually when it came to our identity, because you said it's a marker of identity, our story was that Kuwait was for Kuwaitis. And initially, but what we're seeing now is that, okay, Kuwait is for Kuwaitis, but also we have to take care of the person that was living on this land for such a long time, because he could also get corona. That means that person now suddenly matters. And so the narratives and what we're seeing today about what was happening yesterday, do you see a connection? I love that I'm asking a question now. Do you see a connection between what we've seen in the past to how we're dealing with the issue today?
Yes, I think so. Dominant narratives shape and form. I don't think any story emerges like that overnight. If I feel like I am blessed today, if that's the narrative I'm telling myself and that's the story I'm repeating, I'm thankful, I'm grateful, I'm feeling blessed. That's a story I've been hearing in many multiple and different forms, whether it's from the media or my parents or somebody in school or a colleague. And like it kind of adds up. And the pinnacle is today when something like COVID-19 hits, that's my narrative. It didn't appear out of nowhere. And so I don't know if that's answering the question, but I think these stories are interwoven into society, into communities at large as well. And like you said, I do hope that we get time to talk about what narratives are dominant narratives and who holds them and who shapes them, and what narratives are kind of stifled or almost gaslit. Like there are narratives that when they are spoken and when they are given space, they're immediately discredited. Did I take a tangent?
But why do you think that is? What makes someone discredit someone else's truth, even though it's not the truth?
Well, for several reasons. Number one, it could be threatening to my narrative. I feel like those narratives cannot coexist. So that fragility, that if your narrative, Ghzayil, is real, does it take away from how I view the world, how I have formed my identity and how I've spoken about myself? And so the inability to hold two very opposing thoughts or beliefs. And then I think also narratives are discredited because there's a lot of political gain and power in there's just a lot to gain from discrediting and marginalizing and pushing certain narratives to the wayside.
One of the things that I was doing, because I used to do, we had, I don't know if it's considered NGO, but it was called Hikmah. And what we did was that we had talks, and we would bring the ordinary person and find their story, develop it with them, and they can say it for 15 minutes. So it was similar to TED Talk in similar ways. And we had one person come on the stage. He was a Bidun activist. And we wanted him to tell his story, but he was so, and for the first time, I believe, that this particular audience, for the first time, saw someone who they were used to only reading in the newspaper, who either was a drug addict, who committed suicide, who was poor and asking for money. That there's that person now standing in front of them, talking to them eye to eye.
Yeah. So someone who was repeatedly vilified.
Yes. And so one of the audience members, she comes from a very affluent family. She's not used to having these conversations. So, and she had a very dogmatic view against al-Bidun. She was very sure to say that I'm against them. I'm going to get rid of them. She was always that was always her position. And we made sure that when he would speak, I would say, I don't want you to tell me the story of the Bidun. I want you to tell me your story, living in this country and being a part of it. And after that event, he spoke for 15 minutes. That same woman came up to me and she said, at first I was so resistant, to the whole idea, and I was shaking my head the whole time. I was angry, and it was. She said, I'm trying to quote her. She said, and then something switched on at the back of my head, and then I started to realize, oh my God, when you corner a cat, it's gonna scratch. And that's that specifically. And it was just he wasn't a good performer. His story wasn't very compelling, but it was the fact that it was simply a story that was not allowed to be told before, that had such impact. And all you had to do was sit there and listen and be transformed by it. And so you have so many stories that are around that are just untold, unseen. And I'm assuming in your field of work, you're that person that sort of digs out those stories.
I think why I got into drama therapy in the first place is because I'm interested in performance and theater. And what is theater but heightened storytelling? So it's not only enough to tell a story, but no, we want to tell it with lights, and we want to tell our story with sound and movement and on a stage and have it witnessed over and over and over again as it changes every night. So I'm basically a story addict. Like, just I can't get enough of stories. And what I didn't realize is every person who walks into the office when I'm doing therapy, they're here to tell a story. And it's this space that they're given for the first time to tell and retell and shape their story and move pieces around and discover forgotten pieces, or discover pieces that they didn't realize they felt so strongly about, and to bring in new pieces and to play and say, what if we add this to the story, and what if I go out and try this tomorrow? It's so freeing and empowering, that, like, honestly, it takes a lot of the stress away from me as a therapist, because I'm also a storyteller and a story like receiver, like a recipient of stories. So a lot of times I'm kind of watching clients talk and share, but really I'm looking for that thread, because they're putting together a narrative, and rarely do we have that space and the platform to kind of put all our pieces on the table and reorganize them with somebody. It's such a vulnerable act, and most of us don't have the time, or don't have a person who is safe enough, or we don't have the tools. And so I get to listen to stories every day, and it's even more interesting when I get to listen to stories in family settings, because I also provide family therapy. And so the story sometimes is the same, repeated by different family members, and sometimes it's so fragmented and it's different. And as we're talking, I would love if we could ask the participants a question about how they receive stories, or how they prefer to take in stories. I think that was my second question in the polls.
Yeah, so guys, we are about to receive a poll. It's going to pop up on your screen right now. Here it is. If you could all just vote for one of the two answers, and then we will be receiving your anonymous group response.
So you're speaking about like how stories are told. I think as a therapist, I'm sure you've heard about it. We're so used to our parents being our parents that we sort of forget that they have their own individual story, that humanizes them in such a way. So how does that work, where you share your story with your children about who you are, but also trying to fit in that role of being a parent?
Oh, I love that question, because I think that's the bulk of the work I do. Because for us to understand our narrative, we need to understand like what we're inheriting, and consciously and unconsciously, right? Because as a parent, I could decide to tell you this piece, but I could decide to show you a completely different piece. So I could decide to tell you that our family is brave. However, my actions may show you that I believe our family is fragile and threatened, and our existence might be just wiped out. I can show you with my actions. I can continually quit jobs as a parent, or leave jobs, or come and gossip about coworkers, or use you as my confidant and tell you as my child, well, this happened and that happened. So there is a lot of unpacking of like family of origin. Yeah, intergenerational trauma and intergenerational stories, and then family of origin work, which is, who are you? Who are you, like, or what were you told about you first? What have you absorbed? What did you hear? What was repeated in your family of origin, and how much of that is like rings true? I see you nodding, like something's coming up.
But I was just, but by the way, the poll is, do you prefer to listen to stories or read them? Most people like to listen.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because in our culture, we listen and share stories as a pastime, yani.
Exactly.
I think for us as well, in terms of that intergenerational thing, but it also comes down to, so people that listen to stories, they don't even listen to it the same way, do they? So
what's coming to your mind?
Yeah, so for example, one of the things I love about my mom is that she's a great storyteller. She's a wonderful storyteller. And so a lot of my growth and maturity came because I was like, okay, so what is she saying? That was simply her experience. And what have I learned from her that was reality? And the same thing with all of our parents, all of our relatives as well. Honestly, so it comes down to the word that I always say again and again is the word myth, right? And so can I have the poll up about myth? I want to ask people that question before I go and explain it.
And I really want you to talk more about like, what is reality? I find that really interesting.
Oh my God, that's an existential question, isn't it? What is it? Are we all living in someone else's dream?
I think COVID-19 is a dream.
Oh my God, it's a nightmare, is what you're saying.
I mean, honestly, like we could spend an hour talking about our narratives, our personal and communal narratives of COVID-19, but that can wait. If we have time, we can get into it.
Just the way we dealt with COVID-19, and how you have this, there's always a relative, like each relative in your family took on a certain storytelling aspect. One was the drama, one was the post-apocalyptic one, and then you had the one that was like hopeful. So even in the way we share our experiences, that in itself is determinant of who we are. So what is reality? So the media, as we know it today, we often criticize, oh, it's the media, it's up in, okay, so people are saying a widely held belief.
Yeah, I think most people were saying
okay.
It's a widely held belief. Okay.
Yeah. So it's that, but it's also does a myth doesn't mean it's true or not. It just means that it's held by a lot of people. If you repeat something over and over again, that's the myth. It doesn't mean it's something you doesn't mean it's a fantasy or anything. So we have great viewers. So that's true. You guys are right. I don't have anything to give you. The idea of it is that much of what we know in our lives, on not specifically our households, but I'm saying how we deal with each other on the moment we step out the door, is determined by that myth, by many myths actually. So, for example, we assume Kuwait to be a very small country, and we also assume that it's not as diverse as it is. And so one of the discoveries I've made as I've been working in my field was that, and I said this to Eleanor as well, is that you can drive from one area in Kuwait 15 minutes to the next, and you have a huge difference in the quality of life. And I don't mean we're not specifically talking about poverty or specifically something like that, but it's just in the sense of self-worth, um, or the worth of that human being. And it's just 15 minutes. I went from one school in one area where a child told me he wants to be an astronaut, the other told me he wants to be a captain, he wants to be, the sky was the limit for their ambitions. And then I went to the other school, which was 15 minutes away, and all of them were talking about they want to be policemen, they want jobs with good salaries. And you're talking about 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds that are very realistic about life. That very um, had a harsh dealing with what their life is going to be. If I don't actually have a good salary, then I'm not going to be happy. Uh, and they're the same kids in the same country that is like this small. So we often walk around with the assumption that if we have the same messaging, if we assume that we all have the same worries, that we all assume that we have the same issues uh, at the institutional level, then someone is going to be excluded at some point. And so the idea of who sets our reality is the gatekeeper who assumes that others are like him or her. Um, and so, for example, one of the other children as well said something to me. He said, there's not going to be jobs when I graduate from college, so I don't know when I'm going to work. Again, a 10-year-old telling me there's no jobs. So this is the quality of life that these kids have, that we're assuming simply because we're in an affluent country, a welfare state, that we're also producing well-adjusted children, but we're not.
Or these children are just so attuned to the stories around them in their household. That's the
Yes.
lived experience. And this child is, for me, like as you're speaking of these children, they're good listeners. They heard the story over and over again, and they understood that that's their reality. And they immediately went into acceptance and problem solving. And that's the power of stories, right? It would be so strange for that child to come out of that narrative and say, you know what, I think I'm just going to travel the world. It wouldn't make sense. It doesn't mash with the story they've been told and they've repeated or they've heard consciously or unconsciously, because maybe their parents told them sky's the limit, verbally communicated that. But in fact, maybe dad was really worried about losing his job, or mom was really worried about her position at work, or being able to afford some new clothes for Eid. Yes. And so those worries, adults' burdens and worries, are passed down as stories to children. And I think we forget just how sensitive children are and how attuned they are to stories. They look for stories everywhere. They can put 2 and 2 together and tell you, like, this is the beginning, middle, and end of that story.
100%. And even with the narratives that we're bombarded with as adults, we also take those on as well. Like, we're not even immune. It's not just children. We're also we're not immune to the messaging that we're getting. And it depends on the environment we're in. So today, for example, we're in a very we're in an environment that narratives are very influential, because we're by fear. And so you tend to now want to cling on to the adult, or not the adult, our government, for example, the person that we can look to and say, tell me that everything's going to be okay, and I'm with you 100%, and I'm willing to overlook so many things, but if you're going to tell me that everything's going to be okay. And so again, we really don't grow up from that childlike view of the world, do we? We want that black and white thing.
Yeah, and Ghzayil, you're talking about like people looking up to the government, and again, like for me, on a much smaller level, people are looking at their phones for stories. And why are influencers? This word that popped up, and we're all like, well, what do they have? What do they have? What makes people watch blindly for hours what makes them buy the same coffee as some random stranger on the internet. They are storytellers. They are story curators. They've put together a timeline and they are available and they're sharing. And you're willing to suspend disbelief, right? When you're watching an influencer on any of the social media platforms, there is a part of you that knows this is not 100% their truth all the time. Yet you're willing to suspend that belief as though you're going to a theater or a movie. And you're willing to say, okay, well, their life looks good. I'm sold. I want more of their story. I want to consume it. And I wonder if it's also like, I want to be it. I want it to consume me. And I want to be part of this story that is so attractive and fascinating and it promises something that people want. Usually it's physical attraction, it's money, it's ease, it's exposure to whether it's food, abundance of food, travel, gifts, material goods. And that story is just has the ability to suck people in.
It does, 100%. And even today, we have a question, by the way. Should I be the one that should look at the questions, Leanne?
If you guys see the question and anything strikes you, then by all means feel free to read it out, or I can also interject. But now that we're talking about the Q&A, if I just can quickly mention, I see that a few people are raising their hands. So I just want to remind you all, some of you might have joined a little later. On the bottom panel, you can find a Q&A section, and just make sure that you're sending in your questions from there, because that's what we get. We can't really address the raising hands, unfortunately, with this format. So just make sure you're posting your questions on the panel. And if you like any questions that you really want answered, make sure that you're clicking the thumbs up so they're uploaded. Sorry, guys. I just wanted to quickly recap.
So Fatmah, I think you should answer that one because it's a continuation.
What if the child's own narrative is not matching with the reality? So if the child is following cartoon stories that allow them to say, I want to travel the world, instead of the real story that's being repeated in reality. So this is interesting. You bring up the word repetition. And if a child is watching cartoons and movies and reading stories where that narrative is being repeated, of course, they're going to be open to that. I was talking about children who are often exposed to a limited set of narratives by dominant, like, authority figures, so caregivers, older siblings, people in their family or their little circle that hold a lot of power. But of course, that's how you get the children who do break out of that, because they are exposed to cartoons, they're exposed to music, they're exposed to other children's narratives. So they may go to school and hear another child who wants to be a surgeon, and that sounds interesting, and they start digging into that story and they start consuming it and playing with it. What if I'm a surgeon? And you know what kids play, so they'll play with that. They'll go home and say, I want to be a doctor. And most kids are really, really, really impacted by what their family says. So if I repeatedly say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a doctor, and I'm trying this out, and the parents continually shoot it down, that is harder to recover from. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it impacts the way we organize information in our head.
It's very sad. And also, just to make it clear as well as why we brought up the children and their relationship with reality. Yes, you can. It's possible, like Fatmah said, that you can get out of that narrative that you've been fed. All of us right now are doing something that our parents have not done. All of us, that's happened before. But it took us a while to break away from that narrative, from that story that we've been told, and trying to create our own story. And so it does happen, but it also should help us to have more empathy for those that you see along the way, that you're like, why are they the way they are? Well, there's always a reason for why someone is the way, and it's up to you to try and figure that out if you really want to know why that person that is. Because we tend to want to just say that person is good or bad, instead of saying that person is a victim of their environment or not. So that's why I want to make that clear.
If I may also piggyback off of that, Ghzayil, I think it's really interesting based on kind of just hearing the conversation that you guys are having. It's very clear to identify the power of stories on our own experiences, whether as individuals or our experience of our own communities and other people in our community. Um, and this power is not always positive. Unfortunately, it can also be very negative. It can influence our reality. It could perhaps blind us to specific things like our own privilege or our own bias. And so I was just wondering, what role do you guys think that stories might have on a positive level to flip it on its end? What role could it possibly have in increasing compassion or building compassion in a community? What would it look like if we can reframe people's stories and use it, say, as a window to create more hope or opportunity um, for others?
I think let's say if we look at this from, let's look at real things we've seen. على أرض الواقع, reality. For example, the Syrian war has gone on for like 4 years, or not 4 years, I mean, at that time. And compassion fatigue hit everyone. And no one was able to say, okay, we get that they're going through that, but there's nothing we can do. And so it was harder to get people to donate anymore. It was hard to get people to go and volunteer, until that little boy that was found on the shore. And suddenly that huge complex issue that we don't know how to deal with has now been simplified down to the story of a little boy that died, who suddenly looks and dresses the way like Europeans do today. And so he's not this Arab, he's not that barbarian. We can't even say that. He looks like one of our kids. And suddenly you've seen this huge flow of donations back into the Syrian crisis. And it was just because of that simplification of what it means of having these complex, huge disasters and crises, bring it back down to the human level of what is the actual cost to, I think his name was Aylan, Allah yarhamah. And so we're used to, so for now every day everyone's going on the government website to see how many people are sick, how many people are okay with coronavirus or not, and we're so caught up with caught up with numbers that we really don't want to deal with the stories, because sometimes there is a limit to our compassion. And so then it is possible if we simplify and if we bring it down to human level and tell people that, okay, so now in order for you to help the Syrian crisis, we're not doing that. We're actually telling you, you can stop another child from dying on the shore if you just donate $10 or 10 pounds or euros or whatever. And so now suddenly this huge crisis that I can't do anything about is so easy for me to help.
And to add to that, the person who gets to tell their story and who gets a platform does experience validation. And hopefully the validation leads to healing. So if I've been continually dismissed, if I've continually been told I'm on the margin and I don't matter, and then suddenly to have a platform where I can speak, where I am being taken seriously, I'm seen all of a sudden. I matter, and my story matters, and my story is brought to light. And we don't always need to put somebody on a stage and have them like do a big TED talk. Stories and people matter if we just slow down, and instead of consuming something on the internet, I can engage with you in conversation. I can see the person serving me my food and ask how their day was and how they came here. And I say that and caution with it as well, because very easily could stories become commodities. So I don't want people to think that I need to go around collecting stories, because that's very predatory behavior. And we do see that behavior. We see people banking on other people's stories, banking on people's facial expressions because those tell a story, taking a photo. Like, how often do people travel, or even in Kuwait, and then take a picture of someone, number one, without their consent? Number two, somebody who is different from them. And that's why they think that there's a story there. So either somebody falls in a different like age demographic, somebody is differently abled, somebody's performing something that they're used to. And immediately it's like as if they have free reign to enter that person's life, capture the story and post it, thereby like benefiting and profiting off that story, however they profit, whether it's actual money or likes or their story or their post being shared now. I sometimes do think there's something predatory about that we do need to check ourselves and come to terms with and see how it feels. And consent is more than just going up to someone and saying, hey, can I take your photo? Because power and privilege comes into play. Like if you're approaching somebody who's maybe not 100% focused, or if you have more power than me in society, maybe I can't say no. Maybe I don't know how to say no. Yeah. Maybe I experienced something terrible when I last said no. And so just practicing mindfulness when I'm about to even listen to a story or elicit a story. Why am I taking that story? Why do I think I have a right to it? Does the person want to share? Is the person ready to share? Sometimes I hear qualifiers that don't ring very true to me. Someone will ask something, or right before they ask something, they say, can I ask something really personal? And then they go ahead and ask that question. And really, you asking, if you're going to ask, can you ask something very personal? Number one, you don't belong in my personal bubble. Like, you're now inserting yourself with this question that is kind of hard to say no to. Just the way we've been conditioned, the way we're brought up in society. And so you're entering somebody's personal space for your own benefit. It's you're organizing a story about me in your head. And you need another piece of information from me, which makes you ask, can I ask you something personal? Or I'm going to ask you a question. Please don't answer it if it's like too much information or uncomfortable. Well, that tells me there's something in you that already knows that's uncomfortable, or that's information you might not be privy to. And so stories can heal and empower, and I feel absolutely should be shared, and we should listen more and be present with them a little more, with caution, with humanity, with a little like slow down as you're hearing stories and you're consuming stories, and your ear starts picking up stories.
Yeah, 100%. One of the questions, Dana, sorry, ماني عارفة اسمك your last name, خاطر غلط فيه. She says, generally, I believe we tend to think of stories as narratives of the past. How would you reframe that so that storytelling becomes a tool to change the course of our future? Well, Dana, that is actually part of my تخصص, my political communication. That's all it is. It's about narratives and how it affects society, and how we have to, how I can change a whole society, make them live in fear, to, for example, to follow my every word, and then make it less and less democratic as I go on and on. But for example, in Kuwait's case, if we're going to look at this, one of the things that we need to really be honest with is who is a Kuwaiti, for example. There are so many references to what a Kuwaiti is, or who a Kuwaiti is, and who has the justification to say that I'm a Kuwaiti. That in itself has affected so much of our problems today, in such a huge way. That simple question of who is a Kuwaiti. And that goes down to, okay, so how have I been teaching my past? How have I been teaching, or what was the Kuwait story? Well, we know Kuwait story to be a seaport city that had a handful of families that grew within that small sur, that small collection. And that's where the story stops. It doesn't go beyond that that border that they placed. So they don't talk about what about the people that live just outside that border, still within Kuwait's geographic hudud that we live in today. Forgot all my English. And so even the way we retell our own history today has affected us today, our identity and who we choose and who we want to be, purely because we've been told that all Kuwait is that small seaport.
And Ghzayil, like the moment you said, we don't talk about anyone outside, that's the us and them.
That is very much othering.
You've othered.
Yes.
Now, there's a collective and there is something outside of this collective.
100%. And that collective story is now a myth that we do not want to let go of.
Good circling around to the myth.
Yes. See what I did there? You've been paying attention, Fatmah.
I've been waiting.
And so there it is. It's that myth. It's very much about what we've been telling about ourselves and why we don't want to change it, because it also means that the nostalgia that I go to comfort myself why things are going wrong today, I can still say we've been better. We were better. Mm-hmm. And it's become so sacred, that nostalgia, for me to tell you that, well, it wasn't that great. Well, it was very, also, you excluded a lot of people then that you're doing today. It's not really a matter of, so they find themselves saying, no. I will not accept anything that will actually harm that story that I go to for comfort.
I don't want to tell the myth.
I think, Ghzayil, looking at the Q&A, I think that's a perfect segue into one of the questions that was asked by Anita. She says, what would you suggest on changing one's own narrative, as in breaking out of the repeated stories told to you as they no longer serve you as an adult? So you can extend this to kind of myth and narrative.
Well, actually, that goes to Fatmah as well.
Can you ask that question again?
Of course. What would you suggest on changing one's own narrative, as in breaking out of the repeated stories told to you as they no longer serve you as an adult?
Yeah. Yes. For me, that's yes. Work on that story and retell it and see what resonates and what parts you can retire, what parts no longer serve you, and also what parts you want to distance yourself from and why. And I think that's a really important question, because we're not just we're not software, right? We don't just update to 2.0 because 1.0 is no longer serving me. Why is it that I want to update? It's kind of easier to figure out why it no longer serves me. It's harder to do the work of why I may want to distance myself from past narratives. And as I explore storytelling with people, I often explore shame. Shame comes up to the surface, and shame can be felt. It lives in the body. It lives. It also is acted out, and so we kind of embody shame in a lot of interactions in the way we carry ourselves in relationships and in space. So for me, exploring that, whether you do it in therapy or yourself through reflective practices, can be really powerful work. And as we're kind of like answering questions, can we also ask the first poll question, just out of curiosity?
And Amita, just so I can like just follow up on that great answer that Fatmah gave.
Yes.
Also, be very nice to yourself. Like we're very harsh on ourselves, and also understand that the narrative that you are holding on to today isn't really much. It is possible to change it, but also say that the first thing to do is to say, okay, so what is the narrative, and say it out loud to yourself completely. That's what Fatmah does, is say it out loud. What have you been told? What do you say about yourself when no one's there? And then once you let that out, you realize, okay, that's what needs to go. But you have to say it out loud first and realize what actually you say every single day to yourself without anyone hearing you. And you assume that since no one hears it, then that narrative cannot be questioned. So allow yourself to hear it. There's one question Well, actually, two questions. I think I know who this question is from purely because it's so. I know who it is. Anyway, it's so like academic. Can storytelling be sued
Okay.
among gender attitudes? Be sued among no, you know the story of your name. People said yes. Most people said yes. You
Okay,
know the story.
as you're kind of like reading that question, I just want to say that in itself is something really powerful to uncover and figure out the story of your name and where it comes from, and more than just what does my name mean, but also who gave me this name and why, and what were they feeling and dreaming and hoping. Um, that's usually really important work. Some of us kind of know that narrative in our mind, but writing it can be really powerful, like the story of your name, the where your name came from, whether there was a debate around your name, whether you like your name or not. Sorry, Ghzayil, go ahead.
No, keep going. I love that. Keep going.
Yeah, I don't know. I love digging into names, and I think I see it as part of family of origin work. But I'm interested in the academic questions.
Well, so it's actually a very interesting one. Can storytelling be used, I'm assuming, among normative gender attitudes? So, for
Okay.
example, masculinity. Um, yes, of course. Like anything has a story, doesn't it? Even the way that we develop our toxic attitudes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can't remember, but there's like this great, really old film on YouTube. You can probably find it on how toxic masculinity develops, and it's through narrative and storytelling. And I don't know if you're asking if like we want to break away from toxic masculinity, and the answer is also yes, because you see that even you see that being done in commercials, you see that being challenged in conversations, you see that in songs nowadays.
But how about how do we dispel, or how do we use stories to break off from toxicity and toxic masculinity? I think for one, when I, again, going back to schools, when I was visiting them, what I realized is what boys have been told about themselves, and what they've been told that they cannot share, has really plays a huge part in how they treat others. I think they are very much dehumanized as boys. For example, there's this assumption that all boys have to go to a certain through certain violence to be men, and that initiation thing that we talk about all the time. I think that really plays a huge part in toxic masculinity. And what they cannot accept a story in which a man is vulnerable, and so I think that also plays a huge part.
So the repetition of stories that break that mold are going to be really important. Naming that mold, teaching people what toxic masculinity is. I'm often surprised that when I do bring up that topic with men, how defensive they get. And I'm absolutely not calling you toxic is important. Differentiating, you are not toxic. You are a person who is influenced by toxic masculinity. And what is toxic masculinity? And sharing examples, because like I said, people learn from storytelling. So the more we veer away from simply defining something, but saying toxic masculinity looks like this, and that. Toxic masculinity is the little boy being told you can't cry even though he's watching his mother on her deathbed. Toxic masculinity, and giving these stories and really digging into them so that the person has context, and then we can name it as it happens. And I think we can't share enough stories of men being vulnerable and present and mindful. So the more we do that, the better.
Well,
we're absolutely bragging on that.
The next part of that question is it's two questions. How can we open up existing spaces to accommodate genuine storytelling, like duaniyas and parliament and things like that, to accommodate genuine storytelling? Well, I think for me, I think in our society specifically, it's intergenerational thing where um, don't show our dirty laundry, don't show your weakness. And actually, I just had a conversation with my I think it was with my brother, and I was saying, why do you guys always like really bully each other and you're okay with it? It's different from us girls, for example, I said. And he said, yeah, it's a dog eat dog world. And so you're sort of raised to be in a situation where you have to be always ready uh, to beat on someone else before they beat on you, and that's constantly there. And I'm assuming it happens in duaniyas. We have every guy has a within the duaniya has a certain, they call it ta'luga, which is basically what's it called? A nickname? It's not a nickname. So basically, everyone has a certain thing that they make fun of, and it's considered bonding between them. And even that, in its unhealthy manner, I think those same men that are in the duaniya leave to go study and start uh, university elections, and then those same men go on to be parliament members, and then those parliament members create laws that deal with women or deal with them, and those same
Right.
boys that they.
I think also this brings up a very important point, which kind of reminds us of our role as well in terms of not only storytellers but holders of other people's stories. I think it comes back
Yes.
down to not only the level of respect that we have for other people, but our openness and willingness to be vulnerable and also to hold people's stories, explore them fully, whether they make us uncomfortable or whether they maybe challenge some of the narratives that we hold individually or collectively. I mean, it kind of reminds me of something that Eleanor said actually in the last conversation we were having together, which I really liked. She said, you should always be willing to go further than you expect people to go. And I think that's a very important thing that we need to keep in mind. But looking at the time now, I noticed that we have just a few more minutes. So we are going to open up the Q&A section. If anyone wants to share their questions for Fatmah and Ghzayil, please do so now. And while you guys type them, I will take the time to ask one last question myself.
Okay.
So we talk about a lot of narratives and kind of our experience of narratives and how much they could affect us, whether positively or negatively. And I'm curious to know in a time like this, being in a crisis, I think we are all consuming so many myths and narratives. There's so much noise that is happening around us. And I think that makes it a little difficult to kind of cope with what do you absorb, what do you hold, what do you kind of challenge or try to close yourself off to. So I guess my question is, in a crisis or in a time like this when so many things are coming into sharp focus, um, how do we become selective over the narratives that we choose and the narratives that we put out as well?
So I think for me, what I'm really noticing, what stands out completely, is that this we've been this mob mentality of recently, for example, that woman that talks about this, there's no sauce in her salad, when she was in the what's it called? Is it called the quarantine? The government
Quarantine.
institutional.
Yeah.
And so she was saying, there's no sauce in my salad. And everyone, and I mean everyone, and I was one of, she annoyed me, but like everyone was trying to figure out who her name is, and they tried to call her out. They found out where she worked, and they put all of her information online, regardless of what I think about what she said. We are now experiencing this this discovering, okay, so how far am I willing to give up my morality uh, in for the collective? And so there's this
It's like
issue
a witch
of
hunt.
what.
It's like a witch hunt now that you're describing it like that.
It was scary. It was scary to me. I think for me, that's what scares me the most. Is as much as I'm scared of COVID-19, I'm also scared about how we are choosing to cope with this, by being very protective of procedure and things like that, which I understand completely. But then it also thinks, is this a coping mechanism? Is this how we're trying to cope? We're trying to say, okay, at least I can't do anything. I'm at home, I'm bored, but at least I'll find that person that annoyed everyone and was completely ungrateful, and I'll go and mess that person's life up, and without even feeling anything, because it's on social media, therefore it's not face to face. And so that's what I'm trying to stop myself from doing, is that being that emotional reaction, and having any news that comes towards me, anyone who says anything annoys me and makes me angry, or so that's what I'm practicing. So I'm not there yet.
For me, I would say diversify the stories you're consuming, who you follow online. If a lot of your friends are starting to repeat the same things, that's your bubble. You've created a bubble that is echoing and forming. There's like a confirmation bias now, right? Every time I'm gonna go online, the people around me are gonna say the same thing that I believe, and there's a lot of danger in that. So follow the stories you don't really want to hear, that make you prick. That doesn't mean you have to react to them. It doesn't mean you have to defend yourself. It doesn't mean you have to discredit them. Just listen. And honestly, like, that was still thinking about this question about how do we create genuine or space for genuine storytelling by showing up. But when someone else speaks, we listen. And we don't do that. We would love time, and you will not be interrupted, or you will take a workshop and you will do this. Whereas what really needs to happen is for me to be quieter and take up less space, and nod and make eye contact and tell people that yes, go on, or tell me more, and then not necessarily have to have the last word, because their story matters, because what they're saying, even though it is completely annoying to me, like that woman. I'm really late to the party, I'll admit. I did not know what was happening with the sauce, and my family laughed at me so hard yesterday because I asked, why are there so many memes about sauce? And is it like pizza sauce? Like what sauce are we talking about? Like ranch?
In times of crisis, we are so creative.
And I, my family told me the story. And in hearing that story, honestly, like, I didn't think so much about myself first or what my reaction is. I wanted to know her story. I wanted to know why it was so important to her to have sauce, what she was going through, how empowered she felt by recording that message. Who did she think that message was going to go to? Or did she realize it was going to be widespread? And I think that interest in other people, that just like hold space, listen, and that doesn't drive me to go dig, by the way. I'm not going to go find out and ask her and interview her. Those are just questions and curiosities I can sit with. And of course, like, there are certain actions that are going to have a consequence, but it's not my job, right? Like, no one put me in charge of like figuring out who that person is and doling out consequences. So in my place, I'm just a consumer, and I can hold that story and think about it and not pass it on. But I go back to, as much as you can, diversify your feed. I say that about everything, whether you're consuming like certain body images or certain music or stories. See if you can unfollow people, see if you can follow new people.
Well, Shannon asked a question I think is really ties into what you're saying, is that how can people in privileged positions be encouraged to listen and engage with people who are often viewed as taboo? So basically, I think with Shannon's question, is that privileged is very extremely blinding, and it's sometimes such a hard thing to let go of, because you really do think that um, whatever issues you have are really the bottom of the barrel. You don't realize there's something even harder than that. And so how do we encourage people with privilege is also telling the story, telling them and teaching them about the fact that your privileged is not hard work, or specifically something that or just hard work. It's also something that you've inherited, something that you've um, uh, basically celebrating everyone who suddenly is a millionaire or a billionaire or whatever, or someone who's white or someone who is in whatever, and it's assessing what is success to everyone, what is privilege, and also saying, well, okay, so if that person is privileged, but how am I privileged as well? Self-reflection is such a huge part of that. I can say that I'm oppressed in certain ways, but I'm also privileged in many ways. Um, and saying that doesn't make me a bad person, but but instead of saying privileged, I can say that I have many opportunities to help. And so just changing that, uh, how you would say how you're privileged, say that, listen, at least I have opportunity to help and seek out others and create a platform for others instead of taking on the platform for yourself. I see your head shaking, Fatma.
Just agreeing, just really, really agreeing. Create a platform for other people, and privilege can be an uncomfortable conversation, and that doesn't stop us from having it.
100%. Dan, do you have is there any other questions we can go through, or is that?
Sorry, guys. I think I'm breaking up a little.
Yeah, okay.
I'm experiencing a bit of a... Do you guys...
all the questions. So just to sum up everything that we've been saying, Fatma, since we all have to leave, I think what we're all saying is that your truth is not the truth, and someone else's truth is also truth, but you also have to accept. And this is why when someone says something about their own experience does not mean that it completely destroys yours or takes over yours. It means yours is not enough. Every story is worthy and everyone is enough. And I think through your work and mine, all we're trying to do is try and figure out who are the gatekeepers of these stories, and as well, how do we play a part in those?
I want to thank you both. I'm sorry that I was going in and out of the meeting because of my connection, out of this conversation. I was able to hear some of what you said as a participant for a while, which was inspiring. I just want to let everyone know that this is the beginning of a series. We will be here at the same time the next Mondays coming up, and to really build on this initial conversation. This coming Monday, we'll be joined by Farah Al-Naqib and May Al-Naqib and Rania Al-Naqib. They're three professors who look at... yeah, right.
We're fangirling here.
Yeah, me too. Who really look at that question you left us with, which is who tells your story, who creates the narratives that really define who we see, who we don't see, how we choose to live, how we suffer or celebrate or rise to challenges as a community, and why sometimes that breaks down. And their work, coming from three different disciplines, has really, I think they'll be able to have a very multifaceted conversation to talk about, ownership of stories and creating safe spaces for alternative stories to emerge, and looking at privilege and inclusivity. So I'm really excited about that. And then the next week, we're going to actually have a group of people that have gone through our storytelling, and they've gone through the process of seeking their own stories and maybe thinking initially they didn't even have stories. And we're going to really be exploring with them the transformative nature of finding your story, right? And realizing what it is and living in that story. As I think, Fatima, you've often talked about, like living, like breathing in that story and owning it, and then figuring out how to reframe it in ways that can be transformative to you in your relationship to yourself, to others, to dominant narratives that might be oppressive, and to your role as a member of a shared community and creating shared meaning when you step forth and share those stories. And it'll be really exciting, I think, to hear their process. And Ghzayil, you were very instrumental actually in facilitating that process. And then we have some other things planned later on to continue sort of digging deeper into how we can use stories to strengthen our social fabric, which is really what we're really committed to at Envy. Is, you know, how do we do that? How does that work? What does it look like? So we would really welcome you to join us the same time on Mondays to participate in those conversations with us. And we appreciate you taking the time out to be here this evening.
Can't wait. I want to thank you for giving us a reason to put makeup on. I just want to say that.
I even wore perfume.
Yeah, I want perfume too.
I did too.
Just like
I thought,
myself.
Here, no one's here.
Yeah. like we're going to the office. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. And Leon, thank you for picking up when I fell offline forever and ever.
Yeah, full circle in the end. That's what matters. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for all your insights. And thank you for all the incredible work that you're doing in the community. So yes, we will see you all next Monday, hopefully. Thank you for joining us.